Okay, welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. I want to apologize for the fact that the sound has been pretty soft for the last few weeks. I've been playing with some settings. I hope I've got it better this week for what I plan is going to be the last in my series on the name statistics argument and responses to Gregor and Blais' critique of Baucham's name statistics argument. Today, I'm talking about Josephus as a possible source for name statistics. I want to start by reading a quote from Gregor and Blais' paper about Josephus as a possible source, and then we'll get into discussing it. Other extant textual sources which might have been used to lift appropriately Palestinian Jewish names include most notably the works of Josephus. It should be appreciated that after the initial batch of names occurrences was deposited by the Gospel of Mark, Luke Acts is by far the biggest contributor of contested occurrences to the Gospel's Acts sample. The Gospels of Matthew and John mostly include occurrences also found in other Gospels. Moreover, it is precisely the author of Luke Acts who has been proposed to use the works of Josephus. Just like not even the most vehement proponent of form criticism would assert that Herod the Great was invented in a process of gradual accretion of personal names to gospel traditions, even Lucan scholars not convinced of Baucham's eyewitness testimony thesis are ready to acknowledge that the Lucan author had access to a relatively wide range of first-century Palestinian realia. Regardless of one's position on the question of textual dependence of Luke Acts on Josephus, this makes the Lucan author a particularly suitable candidate for having at least some sense of relative popularity of Palestinian Jewish names, and this is true even if Baucham's eyewitness testimony thesis is false. Okay, there's a lot I could say here. Right up front, I want to say that this having at least some sense is hand-waving. It doesn't help. It doesn't work. Sometimes I think that Gregor and Blais confuse being exposed to some Palestinian Jewish male names with being exposed to Palestinian Jewish male name statistics. And those aren't the same thing. You can run into people who have those names. You can even know that they're from that area without having any conscious knowledge of the necessary statistics. And in this case, as I've said before, it would have to be very self-conscious if you were going to use those statistics to help you to fake persons and make up persons. We're going to return later in this video to discussing Lou Dwall a little bit, who definitely had access to a relatively wide range of first-century Palestinian realia and was even based on Josephus specifically, and does not follow the accurate name statistics. So having at least some sense is it's not going to do the work. But what they're doing here is they're raising the possibility of dependence upon Josephus. Now you notice the mention of after the initial batch of name occurrences deposited by the Gospel of Mark. So remember that Gregor and Blais think that maybe they can account for the names that are in the Gospel of Mark, especially the lists, a list of the 12 and a list of Jesus' brothers, by some vague reference to some other access, especially they mention Maccabean names. I've talked about that in other videos, why the idea of Maccabean names, it doesn't even meet the initial requirements to be a source. The author would actually have to have some other knowledge of name statistics in order for him to know that he should access Maccabean names. So I'm not going to go into that in detail. But what they're doing is they're trying to sort of focus their Josephus theory on the author of Luke and Acts, while sort of thinking that they've already accounted for the name statistics that are found in Mark, especially by their theory that the lists of Jesus' brothers and the list of the 12 circulated separately from Mark and somehow was a separate source from the Gospels. So feel free to go back to my earlier videos for more on that theory. Briefly, let me also notice that Luke is said in a number of places to be in contradiction to Josephus. Things that are just famous with skeptics, particularly the census in Luke 2 is said to contradict Josephus, and that's only one example. But then, sort of when they find it convenient, now suddenly Luke is using Josephus, or might be using Josephus as a source of even something as detailed as name statistics. So you can't have it both ways. The alleged contradictions between Luke and Josephus argue very strongly for independence. Okay, now, if we set aside the question of dating, the works of Josephus as a potential source of gospel names pass a very sort of minimal bar of being something that in logical possibility can logically be used as a source. I called that the bridge of donkeys, the pons asinorum. That's not saying much, by the way. And I say if dating is set aside, Josephus' works are generally dated between like 75 and 100. And so, whether the Gospel of Luke, the Book of Acts are before or after Josephus' works is a very open question. And I think they're definitely earlier. And I certainly think the other Gospels, the other synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Mark, are earlier. John may have been written after Josephus, though I don't think he's borrowing from Josephus. But so the dating question is important there. But what I mean when I say it passes the bridge of donkeys, it must be in principle possible, even if extremely unlikely, that someone could use these works as a source of fairly accurate first century Palestinian name statistics. So we've talked about why, McDonald doublets they don't even have any explanatory power, even though Gregor and Blais bring them up. We've talked about Maccabees and how, unless you already knew that they tended to copy Maccabean names, the Maccabean books wouldn't be something you would know to access as a source. We've talked about why the lists in Mark of Jesus' disciples and Jesus' brothers, those are not separate sources. Those are part of the data to be explained because they're part of the Gospel's data. But finally, when we get to Josephus, we have a body of work. It's a pretty large body of work that actually does, if you know where to look and how to add it all up, reflect some pretty accurate name statistics. It's a large enough body of work. It is not part of the Gospels. It's at least a separate thing from the Gospels. So if you have it, you can think of it as a source. I mean, this is really minimal requirements that, it should at least be meaningful to speak of this as something that could potentially be used as a source, or could be spoken of as a source, something that could be a source separate from the documents. That ain't saying much. This would be an extremely poor theory, though, that they used Josephus as an explanation of the Gospels and Acts name statistics for many reasons. And now, here we go. Buckle your seatbelts. All right. The faker or fakers in question would have to be extremely self-conscious regarding this issue. A faker would have to know or believe that the works of Josephus would help him in this respect. So he'd have to go, I could use this. He'd have to be thinking of the name statistics issue, not just, some exposure to relative Palestinian name popularity, but rather going, hey, I want to try to get my name statistics right. Here's Josephus, and he's got these big, written works. I'm going to take them. I'm going to try to use them. He would have to have access to multiple works of Josephus. It's difficult in itself. You hear that libraries existed at the time, but that can be very confusing. It's not like there was one in every town and, anybody could just walk in and they would have all of the works you wanted, and you'd look it up in the card catalog, and you'd be able to get all of the works, and then you'd be able to look in the index or something. No, even something that's called a library might not have the relevant works of Josephus. If they did, it would you'd have to find that they did. Okay, and like I said, there's no even physical card catalog, like listing. Okay, these are all the works we have, and it's on that shelf over there. They're scrolls. They're not books. Scrolls are incredibly difficult to use for these kinds of purposes. It's like searching at a roll of wallpaper. And John Wyndham's argued that they didn't even use tables for writing. They had low tables for eating, but it wasn't common to use these. So you'd be like crawling around on the floor or on a big space and trying to roll them out and make notes in it. Just incredibly cumbersome. But I'm just getting started. You'd have to know which parts of the works of Josephus to use. Very important. The person would have to be aware not just to use Old Testament names. Now, Josephus' Antiquities, book 1 through 12, it's retelling Old Testament stories. Okay, so it has no claim to be giving us the names that were used around the time of Christ or even a century before that. It's only when you get to book 13 in the Antiquities where you're talking about like the Maccabeans and their fight and everything, that you start to get to statistics that are at least somewhat relevantly close in time to the time of Jesus. So you would have to be aware, don't just grab, Old Testament names, okay? So you'd have to focus on the right parts of Josephus, and how would you know to do that? At least you have to be very self-conscious to say, hey, those are from many years before. I want to focus on around this time. Then we're not just talking about some sums. No, you'd have to compile tables of names, okay, from the relevant point. No word processing, using your own, papyrus or whatever. Tables of names, name statistics, add them up all by hand. This has to be done. Okay, now, I'm going to call this the incredibly cumbersome process, ICP. Okay, so your faker has to be self-aware and then have access to what he needs and then go and undertake this ICP, this incredibly cumbersome process, just to gather his data. Okay, then what? Well, let's ask, how many people are supposed to be involved in this? How many different people are going to have to undertake an ICP for Josephus to do good explanatory, helpful explanatory work here? Now, we don't want to invoke chance. Hey, it's just lucky. Often, if Josephus is going to be helpful, that's supposed to be an alternative to chance. We're not just supposed to be saying someone was lucky. So think about the list of Jesus' brothers. There's only 4 of them, and they're 4 quite popular names at the time. Simon, Joseph or Joseph, Jude, and then James. James is what I've called a tier B name. It's still pretty popular, but not as popular as Eleazar and some others. Eleazar's Maccabean name, as a matter of fact, and well represented in Josephus. But that's not the name of one of Jesus' brothers. So you have 3 very popular, 1 quite popular name. So remember, Gregor and Blais think that the lists of Jesus' brothers or suggest the lists of Jesus' brothers and of the 12 circulated separately, even from the Gospel of Mark. They're almost making their problem worse as far as how many self-aware persons they have to have. Because what are we going to say? the person who, let's say, made up the list of Jesus' brothers, at least 3 of them are not found in any other source as existing. So, he's making this up. He just chanced upon 4 of the most popular names. So now we're invoking chance instead of a good source. And similarly for the list of the 12. All right, so by their estimate, even if you think that the same person made up the list of Jesus' brothers and made up the list of the 12, I see no reason to assume that. And then you've got the author of Luke and Acts over here. So you've got at least 2 people who have to be doing quite a good job. And if we invoke Josephus, that's at least 2 people who have to be undertaking the ICP. Now, Gregor and Blais don't think that that first batch was deposited by Josephus, or at least they don't suggest that. But then we've seen that they don't have anything that even gets across that bridge of donkeys to be a source of the names in Mark and their at least rough reflection of the Palestinian name statistics accurately. So if we're going to bring in Josephus, it's a little bit better, quote unquote, for the author of Mark. Maybe he's also the inventor of the name lists, and he's one guy, and he's going and using Josephus using the ICP. It's really improbable, but at least it can do some kind of work if the person does that. Whereas just alluding to the Maccabean names does not, as we've seen before. All right, but if 2 of the lists circulated separately, then that's and they circulated separately from Mark. Now we have 4 people. We've got the person who made up the list of Jesus' brothers, the person who made up the list of the 12, Mark, and Luke. All right, and we're just ignoring any input of new persons from Matthew and John. There's not a lot, as they said, a lot of completely different persons, even though John is the only author who has a historical character named Lazarus, which was a popular name. So how is this supposed to help? Let's ask, is it just a private obsession with these people who are making up persons, or is the audience of their original audience supposed to recognize this and be impressed by the accuracy? So then are we imagining members of the audience also going and doing an ICP with Josephus and then going, whoa, kind of like what Elon did. Let's remember that this name statistics argument was not made for over 2,000 years after the Gospels were written. And I've said very explicitly that even though I'm a big fan of a kind of gestalt recognition of verisimilitude in the Gospels and Acts, this is not a place where I'm going to invoke that. This is the kind of thing that's very easy to miss. And as far as I know, it's not until Balcom made use of Elon statistics and started thinking in these terms that anybody even thought of it. So, is this just some secret thing that these fakers are doing? Hey, I want to try to make my names have verisimilitude, so I'm going to use Josephus. I don't care if nobody notices. Or did they have some realistic hope of somebody noticing? It's a relevant point. All right, now we get to a big problem. The name statistics are a cumulative effect. And not only have I just mentioned 4 different people, but now I'm going to try to talk about how that's going to work, because each person is only putting in a few persons into his work with those names, and then you have to put them together, okay, to get the realism of the statistics. How's that going to work? All right. So this is well illustrated by the name Joseph. All right. So how could this even be spelled out to get the name Joseph, get an appropriate number of the name Joseph in the Gospels and Acts. It's the second most popular name in that place and time after Simon. All right, and then there is an appropriate number. All right, I'm going to call him Guy 1 because we don't know who he is, right? He's an anonymous guy who makes up the list of Jesus' brothers. So, as already asked, are we going to just say, is he lucky to just land on 4 of the most popular names? Well, if the Josephus theory is going to help Guy 1, then Guy 1 has to have access to these scrolls of Josephus and go through the ICP to find out that Simon, Joseph, Jude, and James are very popular. And for some reason, he's going to have to skip Eliezer, even though it's more popular than James. And even though he's trying so hard, he's going to put in James. Maybe because he's heard that Jesus really had a brother named James. All right. But so just for 4 names, only 1 instance apiece, he's going to have to go through this ICP or just be lucky. All right. Guy 2. Guy 2 is the guy who makes up the list of the 12. For the Josephus theory to help, Guy 2 also has to go through the ICP. But, he's only got 12 to work with. That's a little more than 4. But, there's only so far you can go in a list of 12. Well, let's say maybe he already has the list of Jesus' brothers. So he invents 2 more Simons and 1 more Judas in the Mark list. There's only 1 of the 12 named Judas. And then there's Jesus' brother, Jude. All right, 2 more Jameses, 0 Josephs. Somehow the guy who makes up the list of the 12s, even though he's going through an ICP and trying to gather these statistics and making tables, he just misses the memo that Joseph is the number 2 name. He doesn't make up any Josephs. And, as we say in the Midwest, got to disambiguate the Simons and the Jameses. And even Judas Iscariot, even though there's only 1 Judas in his list. All right, so he does that. He goes through all of that. Guy 3 is Mark. So he's got the lists from Guy 1 and Guy 2, and then he goes through the ICP, and he kind of notices, gosh, if I include those lists, I'm still a little thin on Josephs. Because there were no Josephs in the list of the 12, and I don't want to change the list of the 12. So Joseph's the second most popular name. So Guy 3, who is Mark, invents Joseph of Arimathea, and Joseph, the son of one of the Marys at the cross, because he calls her Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and uses that as part of disambiguating her. And so now we got a couple more Josephs. Hey, there's only so much one guy can do to try to bring the number of Josephs in line with the name statistics. He still hasn't accomplished that. We still don't have enough Josephs. We're going to skip Matthew and John. John comes later. Let's assume Luke is written before Matthew. I tend to think Matthew was written before Luke, but let's assume. We've only got to deal with now, per Gregor and Blais, the next biggest contributor of names is Luke Acts. So Guy 4 is Luke, or the person we call Luke. He's the author of Luke and Acts. All right, he goes through the ICP. He's very self-conscious, and he goes through the ICP, and he realizes that the Christian tradition so far is still somewhat short on Joseph. For some reason, he doesn't notice this on Lazarus. Maybe he makes up that Jesus told the parable of Lazarus, but that's not even a historical person. He doesn't make up any historical persons named Lazarus. But he notices, we're still kind of shy on Joseph's. So, in his first work, the Gospel of Luke, he makes up 1 more Joseph. That's the husband of Mary, in, addition to any other Josephs that he's including. like Joseph of Arimathea, we can say, oh, you got that from Mark. Okay. So the one sort of new Joseph in Luke, just in the Gospel now, not Acts, is Joseph, the husband of Mary. But it gets weirder, because even though he's undertaking this ICP and he's making up more Josephs, Luke does not include the list of Jesus' brothers. So in the Gospel of Luke, there is no brother of Jesus mentioned named Joseph. So he's not even taking over all of the Josephs from the earlier quote-unquote sources. Even in Acts, he only names James, who was Jesus' brother, as a leader in the church. So how does he expect this verisimilitude to work? Is someone in his audience supposed to not be thinking of the verisimilitude of his work only, but supposed to be kind of doing what we're doing now and grabbing Mark as well and putting them together and then thinking of it as a whole and thinking of the verisimilitude, or what? Because he cut the mention of Joseph, Jesus' brothers. But it gets even more striking, because when Luke refers to Mary, the mother of James, who's probably the same Mary as the mother of James and Joseph mentioned in Mark, he doesn't call her the mother of James and Joseph. He just says Mary of James, sometimes given as Mary, the mother of James. So he's even mentioning this person mentioned in Mark, but unnecessarily he's taking off the name Joseph as part of her disambiguation, and thus, reducing the total number of Josephs in his work. Why do that if he's being so self-conscious that he's making up persons? Remember, this is the author that Gregor and Blais are most seriously raising the possibility of, that he used Josephus. And so then presumably in this ICP of using Josephus, he's noticed the popularity of the name Joseph. Then why take back off this Joseph from the disambiguation of Mary, the mother of James, who was involved, and Luke says was one of the ones who came to the tomb, which is also fits with Mark. Mark mentions that she was at the crucifixion. I realized this only yesterday, and I was like, wow, I got to be sure to make that point. Okay. So then the number of Josephs in his own work are even thinner. Now, he doesn't do anything more about that in his first volume, which apparently he sent to someone by itself, Luke. Then he has like this second volume, which is Acts, all right? And there he adds Joseph Barsabbas and Joseph Barnabas, both with disambiguators. So what's this supposed to do? Kind of make up for the fact that he cut a mention of Joseph, Jesus' brother, and Joseph, the son of this other Mary? Or is it supposed to add to a cumulative effect? So now we're getting up to, 6 total Josephs within the whole Christian tradition, or what? All right, I did this. I went through this on purpose to show you how bizarre this theory is, because the statistics are the result of an accumulated set of names, and each author contributes only some. And because of the incredible cumbersomeness of even using Josephus, you have to be super self-conscious to even get these statistics. All right, now I'm going to come back to Lou Dwall. I've mentioned his novel The Spear several times in this series. Dwall is a really interesting calibration. Dwall definitely uses Josephus. He's writing in like the 1950s, 1940s, 1950s. I should have looked up the exact date, but anyway, mid 20th century. Everything's in book form. He doesn't have to, look through a wallpaper scroll. He's clearly got the works of Josephus. He probably owned them. It's much easier after the printing press for lots of people to own copies of books. And he has all kinds of incidents in the spear that we know at that time Dwall really only could have gotten from Josephus, and he's heavily using Josephus. He's clueless about name statistics. So here's a guy for whom the process would be less cumbersome, still pretty cumbersome, no Excel spreadsheet to put your name statistics into that's going to add stuff up or whatever. Got to do it all by hand and so forth. But, he would have found it somewhat easier to do, right? He's got all the paper he needs, all the pens he needs. He's got tables, he's got books. If he wanted to, he could have slogged through and compiled statistics. And he clearly didn't, okay? Had some access to a wide variety of first century realia is a garbage theory. It's a non-theory. And all you have to do is read the spear to find out. Here's a guy who did have access to a wide variety of first century realia, and it doesn't do the trick. Dwall especially has no clue that Old Testament statistics are not the go-to to pull from for your names, and that they're different from first century names at the time of Christ in their statistical numbers. So he uses Old Testament names for his made-up characters, like Boaz, which is probably supposed to be Boaz. I don't think that's anywhere in Ilan. I was searching an Excel sheet yesterday. I didn't even find Boaz. Zadok is in there. He uses Zadok, but it's rare. Okay. Zebulun or Sebulun, I couldn't find. So, I'm like looking for Seb, I'm getting Zebedee, but so he's just grabbing Old Testament names. Sometimes he's changing the form, like Boaz to Boz. I don't think he actually had a source that was the form it took, but he's just sort of randomly manipulating the form, and we'd just be sort of guessing as to which actual names, even in the Old Testament, he's using. He does all kinds of these things, but when he goes to make characters up, as opposed to just borrowing them directly from the Gospels, he's pulling from Old Testament names. He disambiguates without respect for popularity. I've mentioned this before. He's trying to have verisimilitude, but the moral he draws is, they said that the son of so-and-so a lot. So I'm just going to have this person, the son of this person, bar so-and-so bar so-and-so. He just does that all over the place, even for very unpopular names, a lot. So he could have drawn some correct statistical morals if he wanted to go to the trouble from Josephus, but he didn't do so. That's really important because it really helps us to calibrate and helps us to zero in on the hand-wavy nature of what Gregor and Blais say about Luke, and Luke just having some access or some idea. Okay, this is the last of my videos in this particular series. If I think of something else profound I want to add or that I want to say, I will make one later, but for now, this will be the last one, and we'll move on to something else next week. I hope the sound is better for you. I hope that the sheer thoroughness with which I've tried to go through Gregor and Blais and talk about problems is helpful to somebody. I know this stuff is kind of dusty. I know this stuff is kind of intense, but I put it in this form because I know that people like this kind of medium. They can listen to it while they're doing something else. And again, thanks to Eric Manning for taking the audio and putting it into a podcast form. If you don't need to see my face talking, you can do the Lydia McGrew podcast and just get the same audio. Next time, we'll come back and we'll start talking about other things, about the reliability of the Gospels and Acts, maybe about the argument for the resurrection, various ideas that I have to continue here on the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.